Hello and welcome to Seal Spokane's second episode of Get to Know the Jesuits. Today's November 5th, the Feast of All Saints and Blesseds of the Society of Jesus. To celebrate, we'll be hearing from 5 members of the Della Strada community here in Spokane as they share their Jesuit heroes who have gone before us in faith. You can find the times in the video for each.
Peter Claver was from Spain, and when he was 20 years old, he joined the Jesuits. And part of his formation was when he was living in Majorca, he lived in the same community as that of St. Alphonsus Rodriguez. And while he was there, he was inspired to go to the New World. At that time, it was part of the Spanish colony in South America. So he went, before he was ordained, to Colombia, to what is now Cartagena. And while he was there, he was ordained. And one of his major ministry was that he was working with slaves. Colombia was one of the ports where African slaves were being transported from Africa to the Americas. Peter would run down to the port each time there was a slave ship coming in, and as he went along, he brought medicine, food, tobacco, and brandy as a way to greet the slaves who were coming there. There were a lot of language issues. He did not speak many of their languages, but for him, what was most important was the action. So he said, action should speak louder than words. And so Peter ministered to the people in the slave trade. I find his life to be very admirable. I find him to be very practical about the way he approaches things. And he finds God in all things. He finds God in all people, including the people that he worked with, especially the people that he worked with.
Joseph Pignatelli was born in Saragossa, Spain. His mother was Spanish. His father was Italian, and they were nobility, so they had strong links in the Mediterranean area. He was ordained in his mid-20s, and then he was teaching in the high school and basically junior high school and grade school of the Jesuits when King Carlos of Spain, for reasons of his heart, as he said that he couldn't divulge exactly, he kicked the Jesuits out of Spain. And the rector of this community there in Saragossa, knowing the connections of Pignatelli, said, "You take over, I give you my authority." And when he got to the shipping off place, this provincial gave him the authority too over 500 Jesuits that were there. And off they went in ships, batted around from place to place, from Corsica to Genoa, and eventually on foot to Ferrara, which was friendly to Pignatelli, especially his uncle who was cardinal there. And there he began the 40 or more years, first as provincial and then as non-Jesuit when the Pope suppressed the society. For about 25 years, therefore, he was on his own, continually in touch with Jesuits all over the place and encouraging them, and eventually connecting with the few Jesuits in Russia who were not suppressed because Catherine the Great of Russia wouldn't allow it. And the Jesuits came, a few of them, back to Italy, to Parma at this time, and then they had to get out of there to Rome, I believe, and Pignatelli at that point was the superior of the Jesuits, who were still, I guess he was, the rest of them voted him in charge. So that is such a thrilling story, really, of this person that, of course, wouldn't let himself be kicked out of a society that, in name, was extinguished, and instead he waited until the opportunity came. He did not live. He was a few years short of the re-establishment of the Jesuits, but he is a hero because of helping us stay alive and get back to life. And his great devotion, not just to society as such, but to all the people that he knew.
It was Rutilio Grande. And part of what I appreciated about him, he had a temperament. Maybe I identified a little bit with his temperament. He was very sensitive. He had struggled a lot interiorly. But he was a very close friend of Archbishop Romero. And then he himself then was assassinated along with one of his villagers and a little boy. And that was the moment that Archbishop Romero woke up to the reality of what was happening to his people in El Salvador. So Rutilio Grande, a gentle man, very pastoral with his people, very well loved. One thing that really struck me is that one evening, Rutilio Grande was celebrating Mass in a plaza, and government troops came into the plaza and just shot it up right during the Eucharist. And he then left there and went to this big garden party where Romero, who had just been named the Archbishop, was talking and being with the very wealthy and powerful of El Salvador. And he said these words to Romero, "Oscar, don't you see what's happening?" And that was kind of a shot across the bow for Romero. He went down into the plaza and saw just the number of people had been killed. But it was when his friend, Rutilio Grande, was killed that suddenly he had a conversion of heart and soul, and he then fearlessly turned to advocate for the poor of El Salvador. Bill Bichsel went by the name of Bix. He grew up in Tacoma. He had kind of one of these exuberant personalities, filled with vitality and life, and a little wild, to be honest. But his pastoral instincts, his gut instincts about care for people, and especially those who were the most marginal of all, was so right on. He had this intuitive sense of how to be with the poor, the outcast, the less than, and his pastoral instincts were incredible. He was wild. He addressed that part of his life. And then he, in a most serious way, became a very strong peace advocate. He lived in a Catholic working community. He stopped drinking. And twice he entered the federal submarine base at Bangor, Washington, a federal offense. He spent 2 different periods for a year in federal prison for his beliefs in nonviolence. And all the time, though, he exuded this great joie de vivre. And so, he was one of my heroes. I think the Lord cared for him deeply, and he did the work of the Lord in a way that other people couldn't do. When he died, finally, he was buried out of St. Leo Parish, and of course, the number of people that came and the variety of people came, from politicians to cops, firemen, because he grew up in. So he had such great pastoral instincts that I thought, geez, just his intuitive thing. So I'm really grateful that I had a chance to be a scholastic with him, and then through the years, kind of to be around him too. One of my real heroes.
John de Brebeuf, he writes about the vow he's making to not avoid martyrdom. And it's not so much that, that is impressive, although certainly it is. But really, how he does it is to formulate his vow really as it can find its origins in the spirit of the first vows, that is to say, the vows that the novice makes, and the formula that is presented for the solemn profession. So it's possible to trace a trajectory, the vows, the solemn profession, and this vow he makes to martyrdom. And the reason why I find it so impressive, other than his extraordinary courage of leaving France and living as he did with the Iroquois, but it's the question of the vow itself finds its formulation in all of the possibilities that are offered in the first vows, so that martyrdom is not an add-on to the vocation. It's in one way a fulfillment of it. And that does not mean that every Jesuit, unless he is a martyr, does not fulfill the absolute spirit of the vows. But for those men who are called, and John de Brebeuf was one, the way in which he writes the vows indicates the depths of the vocation and the completeness of the first vow, that is wherein the Jesuit now makes the statement, I vow this total commitment I pray this total commitment of myself be acceptable. The Latin word is holocaust, and so the reality of the Holocaust, the complete gift of the self, which is understood in that first vow expression, is so beautifully realized at that point. It's illustrative for all of us. This man, Edward Malatesta, who I met when I was 14 years old, and he was a regent at St. Ignatius, San Francisco. And, excuse me, and he taught me Greek in sophomore, junior year. And the model of his fidelity and goodness was very touching to me as a boy, and he remained my friend all my life. We lived together for a while at St. Ignatius, San Francisco, when he was founding the Ricci Institute at USF. But it was a friendship that really was very significant for me. He was a man for whom the ministry in China, which he finally wound up doing, as I indicated, he founded this Ricci Institute. It was a ministry that he undertook in his 40s. Prior to that, he had been a scholar and taught the Gospel of St. John at the Gregorian Institute in Rome. And, but he had always wanted to go to China. And so he finally got the permission, and he got the permission first to go down to the Institute of Languages in Monterey, and he told me that he told God, if I can learn this language, Mandarin language, at 40 years old, that will be confirmation that you want me to go to work in China. Well, he learned it beautifully, so beautifully that he could lecture in Mandarin at the University of Beijing on the Gospel of John.
About Mateo Ricci, who isn't a canonized saint, but he is in the works. He's a servant of God. So I remember in the novitiate, when we were learning about the history of the society, being struck by Mateo Ricci, particularly because of the enculturation that he did. So he was born, he was born not long after Ignatius died, so he's sort of the next generation of Jesuits, and part of that huge group of Italian Jesuits who emerged and went to he was educated in mathematics and astronomy and things like that. But he entered the society and, before too long was sent to the missions in China, which was the Portuguese village of Macau. And from there, what he did was he learned, what was most impressive to me was that he learned Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, like perfectly. Slowly but surely got to know important people and bring Catholic tenets of faith by way of through their Confucianism and through the leadership. He actually got to meet the emperor, which would have been a very extraordinary thing. The reason why that's all so impressive to me is the thing about going through somebody's door and coming out God's door, in a sense. So as a high school teacher, I hope to do what he does, which is find the places where they live. He would translate the catechism into Mandarin Chinese. And he could do it the other way around too. So he translated a bunch of Chinese things into Latin and a lot of Latin things into Chinese. And his whole purpose was to teach them about Christ and about his love for everybody in the world. That's what I want to do as a high school teacher, is to teach my students that God loves them.
Alberto Hurtado, born in 1901, and he eventually went to the University of Chile in law school and graduated in 5 years or so, entered the Jesuits at about 1918. His whole interest and focus in law school had been the poor of Chile, the social problems that made their life so difficult and impoverished. And then going into the Jesuits, he carried that same devotedness to and care for the those that were worst off in the country. And in the Jesuits, he really threw himself into the Jesuit life, was ordained in his late 20s, and began an apostolate that went in all kinds of directions. It was a kind of a social apostolate that had other ramifications around the country. It was well known, still is, and he threw himself into that. But he was also at the same time a very devout person, very devoted to the Holy Eucharist, someone who gave retreats continually, and Eucharistic presentations, let's say, and very active in the sodality, informing young people. He had a tremendous attraction for young people, the young, and a great appeal to them. He made a splash at one time in his early 40s with a book that he published. Is Chile Catholic? Is Chile really Catholic? Because he just looked at the social order in the country and the impoverishment and the lack, what he saw as the lack of social conscience and love of Christ. The two worked together with him. He did a fair amount of writing, and he especially began the monthly journal, magazine, called Mensaje, Message, which again is still probably the best in Latin America, of a monthly Jesuit periodical. So he was a very intelligent person with such a great heart. And that's the appeal for me. He died at age 52, so he really did pour himself out.
Thank you for joining us in today's video. If you'd like to learn more about the Jesuits, check out Jesuits.org. If you think you might be called to be a Jesuit, go to beajesuit.org.